So first of all, who is this? Who are you?
Ric Merrifield.
Hi there. What's your name again?
Ric Merrifield.
Great. And what do you do here?
So I run the Motion Initiative.
Motion Initiative.
Right.
That's something that we have no concept of what it is.
Yeah.
On the outside world,
right.
has no idea.
Yep. So it's been in various forms. It's been in incubation for about 3 years. Okay. That's a derivative work of that map that Norm Judah built 7 or 8 years ago.
And tell me, what am I looking at here? What is this?
Right. So about 8 years ago, the decision was made to get us into the business software space. And Norm and some others working for David Vaskovich said, we don't know anything about business software and we don't know anything about the customer business software. So for us to get into that space, we need to learn about both.
When you say business...
like Dynamics, MBS, Great Plains, that business software.
Okay. Because we're doing Office, right? Every business in the world uses Office.
Right. So this is more the business application software space.
Got it.
And so they said, we don't know anything about the customer. So let's hire some consultants who know those customers and take some of their best practice knowledge. But rather than taking some of the conventional views of process maps and IT architecture and org charts, let's isolate the blocks of work, like what work gets done at a fairly detailed level, and let's have a composition-decomposition model that allows us to look at what those blocks of work are in context. So you look at the whole business, as well as some of the outside organizations that business does work with, customers, partners, suppliers, regulatory bodies, financial services organizations, and so on. And that's what that map is. And so it's over 1,100 specific blocks of work that we now call capabilities that are distinct from process maps in some fairly specific ways. And then they took this map and did overlays of software modules built by third-party software companies at the time, who to see where does Great Plains play, where does Siebel play, where does Onyx play, for example, just to see where there was coverage in terms of the work set covered in the overall map, and that informed our acquisition strategy to buy Great Plains and Navision. So it served its purpose. We got some understanding of who the customer was. We got an understanding of who the players were. Got into the space through acquisition, and then so fast forward to a few years ago, Norm Judah, who built the original map, continued to use the map because it was different enough and interesting enough and impressive by itself. Would take it out to customer sites to ground conversations and say, well, here's, tell me about what the specific issue is, and tell me what part of the business this issue sits in. Is it product development? Is it demand generation? Is it fulfillment? Is it planning and managing the business? Basic blocks of work. And every time he did that, the customer would say, that's really cool. I want one of those maps for my own business. Can you personalize one of those maps to show me my own business? And Norm, for years, said, well, that's not really the business we're in. We don't really do that kind of consulting. That's not very interesting to us. Until he started to see that these conversations were helping us to articulate the business value of a services-oriented architecture. Because for any one of these blocks of work, you could say, well, if you outsource it, you're going to have a service-level agreement. And each block, because it's very clearly defined boundaries, you could just take a block and say, okay, that's now done by, logistics is now done by UPS.
Yeah. Yeah, I just saw one called take orders, right?
Right.
Accept orders.
Right, so very clearly defined blocks of work. And so business customers know what a service level agreement is from the outsourcing world. You say, well, even if it's not outsourced, you should still have a lot of those same metrics around it. We'll call it a service level expectation. It's not as formal, it's not as contractual. And business people understood that, and you should have the clear boundary around the block of work and metrics and a lot of the service definition of that block of work. And all of a sudden, in really simple language, you've got the word service in the mouth of a business person that maps pretty cleanly to the word service when it comes to services-oriented architecture. Yeah. And all of a sudden, we started getting improved dialogue between the business understanding the value of a services-oriented architecture and also the IT people understanding how to define the size of a web service to map to a business function, as well as how to make some decisions around reuse of web services from a prioritization perspective. And so Norm and Ulrich Hohmann saw this happening and said, okay, now we've got a clear place to point this in a context that is relevant and interesting to Microsoft. Let's do something with it. And so Ulrich, running this virtual enterprise team as it was known at the time, was looking at some ways to incorporate this model with the Software Factory model of Keith Short and Jack Greenfield. And so define capabilities in a way that very cleanly aligned with the domain-specific language and Software Factory language of their world. And in the process, we filed 5 patents around this definition of what a business capability is and how you schematize it and assemble different business architectures, and you have different template models and all kinds of different things were the patents that we filed. And coming from a business consulting background, I said, well, I think I could deliver this as a methodology to MCS and to partners so that they could pick this up. And even though this map is kind of daunting, help customers understand where to start with it, articulate the value to them, build some tools around it so it's very reusable and understandable to the Microsoft field, which doesn't have really strong soft skills and doesn't really know how to talk business to customers, which isn't a surprise. But having now 8 business industry templates, we can go in and say, we understand the basic business architecture of your industry. What differentiates you is your people, process, and technology as applied to that business architecture. So how you go about doing logistics and taking an order and fulfilling it and all those sort of that's where differentiation resides, and that's what defines what profitability lives in a company. So a simple example that I use often is comparing Costco and Sam's Club. Those are 2 companies that are in high volume retail space. Sam's Club and Costco have the same almost identical business architectures. Sam's Club makes all their money from high volume retail at very low margins. Costco doesn't make money selling their products. They make all their money from membership. So different emphasis on their business architecture drives their profitability, drives how much operational capital they get. So they're very clear at a very detailed level what differentiates them, what defines their brand, and all those things. That's not very common in the business world, which is a little surprising, but most companies aren't that specific about where their differentiation is and where their profits come from. And so now we have these industry templates and a prescribed set of 20 questions, literally 20 questions, that we've armed.
What kind of questions?
Tell me the business value of this specific block of work. So we'll sit down with a business owner, and they'll own 5 or 10 or 20 of those blocks of work.
Right.
And then so we'll say, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the highest, what's the business value of this capability? Does it contribute to the profits or the customer satisfaction, or is it something more like payroll that has to be there and has to perform at a certain level to be compliant, but it doesn't really have a lot of business value?
Right.
Ask what's the business value, how mature is it, how interconnected is it with other capabilities, how is it performing today? Some process questions, some quantitative performance questions, like how often do you do this a month, how much does it cost you, do you know how do you define success for this thing? And then from there, we have some really interesting heat mapping tools where we can generate a comparison. So show me the high-value capabilities that are underperforming. So then the field can say, oh, okay, now you've told us what your high-value capabilities are underperforming. Here are, in a context that's now fairly straightforward and clear for us and ISVs and the customer to understand, map examples and case studies and tell a very clear story where the Microsoft resource still doesn't know anything about the industry or the customer per se other than what they've gotten back from those 20 questions.
Right.
Really simple, reusable tools that then allow us to get more detail about, well, what is the particular project? Is it about services-oriented architecture? Does it make sense then to do a full motion engagement? So the motion methodology, which leverages this now patent-pending definition of business architecture, is an 8-week consulting engagement that we sell to help solve a specific problem.
Okay.
Should I outsource this thing? How do I apply services-oriented architecture? I just did some mergers and acquisitions activity. I've got like duplicate departments. Should I keep the people and the process and the technology separate, or how do I think about combining those in sort of as efficiently as possible?
Right.
Kinds of questions that we answer in the full motion projects. But we always deliver business architectures, and we always, however long the project
Take me through this map a little bit.
Okay.
It's a pretty interesting map now that I'm taking a look at it.
So the top left right there is creating products and services, and that then decomposes down a couple of levels of detail. Then number 2 to the right is generate demand, which would be the sales and marketing function.
And what kinds of things are under here?
That's where you're taking orders, you're doing a lot of the marketing things around understanding the market space and building collateral and doing marketing campaigns, and then feeding off into sales, which is then creating an order. So this map is from a template perspective, is intended to reflect the manufacturing world.
Okay.
And so we have the other industry templates. We've got several banking and insurance and logistics. We've got a professional services company. And they're surprisingly similar in terms of the macro level definition of the business. They have some different labels based on industry.
Right.
But
what are the lines showing in between these little modules?
So the connectors between the capabilities, there's a fairly rich connection definition in terms of the information that goes between the relationship and the dependency that exists between the capability.
Interesting. And you have
so you got fulfill demand. So that's the collaboration is in the middle. That allows you to collaborate with your partners on the outside world, as well as communication across the rest of the company in terms of how does demand generation interact with fulfillment.
Right.
So once you take an order, what's the communication, collaboration, planning from a budgeting and strategy and execution perspective, and even from a technology perspective, what kind of collaboration is needed. And then if fulfillment is in the manufacturing case, the one we're looking at, what you do to make it, how you ship it. And then section 4, the plan and manage the business, is around the basic financials, account management, accounts payable, accounts receivable, general ledger, human resources, IT capabilities are in there. And so
what are the little M and TS and
so
R?
we did some on the top left corner of the board there. We did some industry mapping. So there was some analysis of how each capability would or wouldn't relate to some different industries. Even though this was originally designed for manufacturing, so some of the ones around HR, we now will point out and say, if you are in a business that has unions, there are certain capabilities that are just not relevant, that are relevant, versus if it's a non-union business, those capabilities don't have any relevance to you.
Right. Now, let's say a major company like General Motors. How much of this map would map to their business?
Good question. So General Motors, so this is one business architecture, and we would say General Motors, we've got a picture of what Daimler Chrysler looks like, and I suspect General Motors is pretty similar. They've probably got 20 or 30 businesses, and so each business is going to have its own business architecture, just like Microsoft has historically had 7 business units, like home and entertainment and information worker and so forth. Each of those is going to have its own business architecture that describes what they do. How they choose to implement the business architecture, they may implement it one time or many times. So in an enterprise, human resources is typically implemented one time, even though each business has its own capabilities reflective of what HR does.
Yeah.
IT in our company is actually split into 2, where we have infrastructure and messaging are implemented once for all business units, but business applications are actually spread across the multiple business units. And that's an implementation decision that the business units were given control over what application software they have supporting their businesses, and that maps very cleanly to their business architecture. So now, as we map these business architectures, so for a company like General Motors, to answer your question, we would ask what division of the organization they're looking at. Is it a business-specific problem in one of their divisions, or is it something like HR or IT that's probably going to span the entire enterprise to get an understanding what the drivers are, what some of the different requirements might be, either geographically or by business unit, to understand how we would make a recommendation around that issue.
Wow. What surprising things have you learned by building this?
The 2 biggest surprises for me have been how consistent these maps are across industries. So while you get radically different process maps for companies in different industries, even companies in the same industry, the language for what work is actually getting done is surprisingly similar across industries. And so something like healthcare, you're going to have a few fairly dramatic differences. Public sector is one that's radically different. So government organizations are very differently organized. So sales and marketing is not a big department in government organizations. But other than that, the consistency. So our ability to start with this standard manufacturing map for any new industry that we haven't done, we've now got the 8 industries mapped. But anytime we go to a new industry, we use this, and the delta in terms of the difference from the original map to the new industry map is not that big.
Right.
It's just really fascinating. And then the other surprise to me is how few companies are as specific as Costco in terms of where the value is, and so the things that we refer to as what they care about and don't care about. So payroll is the one we say you don't care about because it doesn't contribute to profitability or your key performance indicators. It has to be there, and has to perform, and has to be compliant, but you don't really care about it. So the only thing that would be worthwhile to you to invest in that would be to cut costs out of it. If I can cut costs out of payroll without degrading the performance, that's really interesting, and that's a great conversation. Microsoft is really good at having that kind of a conversation. We say, you don't really care about who does it or how it gets done or what kind of technology is behind it. If we can drop some technology in and cut costs out, that should be all you care about. Versus something that's differentiating and driving profits, it's a very different kind of conversation where it's really important to understand the role of people and process and technology.
Now that sounds pretty cool. It sounds like you're replacing jobs with technology, right?
No. It's being very forthright with organizations, because a lot of organizations, because they don't have such a holistic view of their business, think that everything's important, which to a certain extent it is. In the business, it's just a question of who does it and how it sits in their priority stack. Because any person in an organization has only got so much bandwidth in terms of focusing on what they can care about, and having an explicit definition with crisp metrics to say, here's how to think about prioritization of a project and payroll versus one that will drive profitability. Both can be totally valid, but have very different kind of contribution to the business.
Wow.
And so helping people understand, because a lot of people will latch on to process and say process is always important. It's not always important. It often is, but helping to get explicit about where process matters and where it matters less is something that this helps expose and get to a very objective, confrontational conversation with customers about. And customers love it because it's the business people get it and the IT people get it, and they can get away from some of the politics, the project selection discussions and the role of technology. Because a lot of times we'll see businesses sort of getting over the fence and telling IT what technology they should use. And this also helps sort of create a boundary for the IT department to say, you know what, we've got your business requirements, we understand the business capabilities and the metrics. It's our job now to map that to our IT architecture and make decisions about how we're going to support you, and we know what your service level expectation requirements are. And so sort of push the business back to the other side of the boundary really helps define roles and responsibilities and add some clarity in the category of good fences make good neighbors.
Yep. Now, usually we have software developers on Channel 9, right? Guys who build code. You're not one of those, right? You're like a business
software.
geek, right?
I am a business geek, although I did do a lot of development on RPG code in the early 90s, which I haven't had to draw on lately. But I do understand schemas and data models and logical and physical data models and coding, and I can have that conversation to a level. Yeah. But yeah, I'm a business geek. And helping to seeing and having seen the tension between business and IT, for me has been one of the big passions about using this to help customers be more successful by opening the communication lines. And then selfishly for Microsoft, seeing how having the business get better objective requirements to the IT, then IT comes to us, it's much cleaner for our field people to say, now I understand what you're trying to do and how you're measuring it, so it's much easier for us to map the business value of our products and services to those needs.
Right. What's the trend you're seeing in business? Because you're one of the few guys who actually goes out and studies how business is working and how it's changing, I guess, because of our technologies and other people's technologies. What are you seeing? Are you seeing trends? I see some because I get to go out. I visited a brewery in Cork, Ireland, and I saw very few people. Mm-hmm. That's certainly over 100 years. You could see a definite trend of how the work gets done. Right. It's done by machines now instead of people.
So I think one of the biggest things for us is that, and where the name Motion came from for the methodology, is that a lot because of technology and the internet, the pace of change has really accelerated. And so having IT architecture maps and process maps that often become out of date very quickly, businesses have to be more right when they make a decision because things change so quickly. A wrong decision or a decision based on inaccurate information can be pretty risky. Yeah. And so having a more stable view of their business to understand the role of what really matters, what's really important to their performance, really helps them make some of those decisions that they are having to make at a more rapid pace. A business that's always in motion, having a stable view of that business really helps. But as the scorecarding and metrics and that topic becomes increasingly popular, there still isn't. It's uncommon for me to see a company that's really detailed in terms of how a specific function of work directly or indirectly relates to organizational performance. And this helps give people a set of tools to map that and measure that and define from an operational perspective going forward where the value is and where they need to make changes. And so that's been what do we do about this? The tension is, what do we do about this increased pace of change in business, and that this is proving to be a sort of interesting and useful way to help begin to answer that question. I'm sure it will mature over time, but it's given people something that they haven't had before to help manage and deal with that change.
Are you using this methodology here at Microsoft?
We are.
You are. And how is it? Do you have conversations with like Steve Ballmer about this and
Not yet.
say, hey, let's go and look at what Microsoft looks like and where we could spend some resources to improve?
No. I mean, so sort of a reason we don't talk to Steve about it thus far is that the Steve conversation would be a more strategic conversation. This is more of an operational, lower level. I'm in charge of this function. How do I improve it? How do I think about improving it? So. Connecting that to strategy, and so the people that we work with have more interaction with Steve, but the work that we do, so we've been doing a project with Stephen Chaney and Todd Baumeister in Services and IT, where they're rolling out a future state architecture project, rolling out some additional technology, where they had a very clear sense of the the current state architecture and the future state architecture and how they were going to move forward to that future state. But they, before they started using Motion, didn't have a clear articulation of the business architecture.
Gotcha.
And so now, using Motion resources, we've articulated the business architecture and linked that to the technology architecture, so there's clear alignment in terms of what the business needs and goals are at that level, so that we can get clearer prioritization of which projects will have the highest impact, and where, if there are some other in-flight activities in the business where we don't want to be too disruptive, to see what some of those different in-flight activities are and plan around them so that we can have the highest impact without some of the downside risk. And so that's been really insightful, not only to increase Todd's understanding of how his customer, Norm Judah and Rick Devenuti, manage their business, but also help drive the prioritization discussion and drive the value conversation to say, does it make sense to spend X on this project? What is the explicit value return, to get more specific about that and have a sort of complete view of that business and the role of technology in supporting it. That's one example.
Interesting. Where do you see businesses making mistakes? Or where do you see businesses, where would you say the biggest pop for most businesses is going to be by focusing on that area? You know?
It's really interesting because the different customers, we did some work with a bank where it was a branding project. They thought that their path was going to be through having a clearer brand and a clear value message to their customers. And it turned out that why their customers were really doing business with them was different from why they thought. And so in this case, it turned out that for the bank, trust should have been the number one priority to focus on. They thought it was having friendly customer service agents and a clear, consistent face from the bank to the customer, when in fact customers came back and said, you know what, I get so much content either from email or from regular mail telling me that I can restructure my credit card debt or refinance my mortgage. There's no trust from any of that mail. And if this bank could establish trust, and that people could even go out to a website and help do everything from make sure they had the best interest rate for their mortgage, or that their credit card debt was being managed had the right interest rate, and that the bank was taking care of them, that level of trust was going to be enormous for them, both from a differentiation perspective and from a brand perspective. And then we were able to say, okay, for these specific capabilities, there's some really interesting technology you can put behind this to build that trust, to drive profitability, versus it just depends on the problem space that the customer's facing. I mean, that for us is one of the big differences in the Microsoft discussion is, rather than leading with a technology discussion, we go and say, what is on top of your list? And so we don't judge what their list is. We just ask them questions and try to help them with what they think their highest priorities are. We had a really interesting conversation.
That sounds like a different approach for Microsoft, doesn't it?
It is.
Because we're not known for coming in and listening and asking questions. And,
right, which is why this 20 questions approach that we have has been helpful, is that there's really high value in just asking those first 20 questions, and listening to what the customer thinks their priorities are helps us inform our focus on how we can help, or if we can't help. And I think one of the sort of the little-known problems in the field is that a lot of people spend time trying to sell something to a customer that's just not the right fit. And if we can more quickly see that's not the right fit, either because it's not really what the customer needs or whatever, move on to something else that is what the customer needs, much more efficient conversation and more likely to end up in product and services selling, that also the customer says, wow, Microsoft figured out what is most valuable to me, and they weren't selling me something I didn't need. They understood enough about my need that it was a useful conversation. And it's going to be a long transformation, but we've seen some interesting data points that suggest that this is helpful.
So this map helps you have better conversations.
Mm-hmm.
What's the innovation here? What was the, and usually in the geek world we use innovation as
right.
Something cool on the screen, or
yes.
Xbox 360 is
mm-hmm.
innovation. What's the cool innovation here?
The innovation is that the process maps and org charts and technology are accurate and valid reflections of how work gets done today, the implementation of the work, if you will. And the business architecture, what we talks about what work is getting done. So if pay employees is the what, that's what I'm doing. How I do that, whether it's outsourced or automated or manual or whatever, those are all implementation decisions. And customers just aren't used to having this what view. They get it once you describe it to them and give them a few examples. And then when you show them that the what for a company in their industry is pretty similar, that you can give them an industry map and help them expose a lot of the metadata behind that what. So for any of the capabilities The more detailed questions beyond the 20 questions: who owns it, who's the customer of it, how do you measure it, what governance and compliance things are attached to it, how has it performed historically, does it or does it not have anything to do with brand or profitability or the key performance indicators of the organization, how many people do the work today, where is it geographically. Very specific set of content that we capture that the customers know the answers to. When you ask them a question, they just don't have a place to put it today. It's just exposing a new view. And we use the word expose very carefully, that we're not creating a new view. We're exposing information that the customer already has. They just don't have a place to put it. They have a place to represent it. And so by asking them these questions without having to be an expert in their business or their industry, we expose this view for them that's really valuable and different from other views that they have. And the fact that it's so much more stable is the other innovation.
Now, when you're asking these questions, are you putting this information in a piece of software?
Yeah, we have an Excel-based tool. That's what we use to generate the heat maps. And then we also have a SQL Server tool that has the more robust set of 150 properties that we'll store for the more robust version. And then we have some Visio links to that to allow us to do some 3D rendering of how the business architecture relates to technology, architecture, and process, and org chart.
Wow. So who in the business do you want to talk to?
That's a good question. Today, it's been very opportunistic, and so we often will come into the most senior contact that the account team has, which will be the CIO or one of their direct reports. Increasingly, we get executive sponsors from the organization that have business side relationships, and the short of it is they'll say, look, we've got this really interesting thing called business architecture, that we've got the Motion label on it. We think we've done some really interesting projects with other customers. You should listen to the Motion team for half an hour just to learn about some of our case studies and see what tools we have available. And that's often how the conversation starts, and the customer typically has a pretty low expectation of the fact that they expect us to not have very much to say in terms of new and different for them. And then when we show them the maps and the tools, they're like, oh, this is different enough from what I'm used to seeing that I'd like to have a more detailed meeting, and I'll invite some other folks and have a discussion about what we might think about doing with this and what the value of this is. And it goes from there. And the customer is always interested, and that by itself is driving some transformationally different kinds of conversations with customers, which is fun.
Now, a lot of this looks like it could lead into an interesting workflow discussion.
Oh,
we
yeah,
have
absolutely.
Some really cool new workflow tools. Are you working with those teams to try to bring them in later in the process?
We've been working more with, this business architecture is absent of flow by design. It just says what you're doing. It's not until you talk about how you do it that you start to see flow. So there would be a very clear connection between those two things. Thus far, I've been spending most of my time with the Visual Studio team and the MS project to add some business architecture to the software factory work of Keith Short and Jack Greenfield, doing what they call in their language would be business factory work, linking the two so they have a more technology-oriented link between IT and business. And then an MS project having an underlying business architecture view so that each project has some context in terms of what it's doing for the business, together with a product that we just bought, a company that we just bought, UMT, that's project portfolio management software. The three pieces together tell a fairly interesting story. We had done some conversation with the workflow people. The name of the team is escaping me now, but we haven't lately. But it would be a logical step to take.
Yeah, the BizTalk guys and the
right.
people. Yep. Interesting. What else do I need to know about what you do and what this allows businesses to do?
The fact that we're formally still in incubation. We have not launched.
Now, what is it? I don't think on Shell 9 we've ever talked about incubations here at Microsoft, particularly here at Microsoft.
So an incubation here is actually different from most people's definition of incubation. Incubation in services, so I currently work in worldwide services, including Microsoft Consulting Services. All that means is that Microsoft is still funding it from Redmond, that the local geographies are not yet self-funding and self-sufficient to run these practices on their own. And so the expectation is at some point in calendar 2006, the Redmond will stop funding a lot of the resourcing, and that the individual geographies will have their own sales and delivery teams to take all of the different tools and the methodology and deliver those on their own. And we've now sold enough of these projects externally and also internally that we know that the methodology works. It does some really interesting things in terms of relationship development and account management. We're just deciding, because it is so different from what really Microsoft has done in the past, from how we talk about it with customers, how we can roll it out worldwide, who has the skills to have these kinds of conversations with customers. That's what we're still learning about before we sort of do a big launch of it. And so Motion is a code name that'll probably go away at some point in 2006. And I don't know what name will survive. I suspect. Well, I'm pretty sure.
Now, how do you train internally employees on this new methodology?
It's been about half external hire. So I came from a business consulting background, and a lot of the people that I've hired have also come from a business consulting background. But I have hired some people. So Brad Clayton in Canada, for example, who runs Motion Canada, was an enterprise strategy consultant who happened to have the right soft skills from a business consulting perspective, as well as some really valuable technical skills, and so he turned out to be a really good fit. Chad Cornell was somebody who came from the MBS, now Dynamics, side of the house as an engagement manager in consulting, and then an external hire, Murray Simser. So it's just been a mix. There aren't that many people in Microsoft who have the right skills from a growing and sort of the entrepreneurial side, growing the team. As we see now that there are a lot of people in the field who can ask the 20 questions and build the heat maps. That pool of resources is pretty big in terms of who can do that. But we're still learning about that, and that's part of the fun.
So employees should get a hold of you if they're interested in learning more about
that.
this?
Yeah, that's fine. The best way to reach me is just motion@microsoft.com.
Motion@microsoft.com. Okay. And customers can reach you there.
That's right.
And employees too. Very cool.
Okay.
This is really interesting stuff. And
Thanks.
we look forward to seeing how it changes businesses.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you'll see there will be more information about an upcoming launch, and coming out of the incubation stage will be happening sooner rather than later. We don't have any hard dates yet.
Okay.
There'll be another version of the tool, another version of the methodology that are close. We just don't have any dates yet, and we're trying to line those up with some other major dates in the organization.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.